Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for an exciting event here at CSIS. My name is Max Bergmann. I am the director of the Eurasia Program at CSIS, and as well as the director of the Stuart Center. I'm honored here to have Ambassador Hogan, who is currently serving as acting U.S. Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. We're here today to discuss the future of Western aid to Ukraine, the state of the war, and transatlantic relations. Before we dive into the conversation, let me just say this event is part of a project run in collaboration between CSIS, the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, in London, and the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, in Oslo, that looks to foster greater understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing the transatlantic relationship, as well as how they will impact the United States, Norway, and the United Kingdom. And with that, there's sort of no more important topic than the war in Ukraine and the ability of the transatlantic alliance to sustain support for Ukraine. In today's discussion, we'll focus on the Biden administration's priorities for Ukraine aid going forward, potential obstacles, and how the administration plans to work with European allies and partners in response to this war. And that's why we're so excited to have Ambassador Dereck Hogan here. And let me introduce him briefly. Ambassador Hogan is a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service. He's a career diplomat. And previous to his current role, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Moldova. He served in senior positions not only in the State Department here in Washington, but has served abroad in Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Russia, Belarus, and elsewhere. And since September 2021, Ambassador Hogan has helped lead the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and is currently in the role as Acting Assistant Secretary of State. So you're the one right now in charge, and we're really glad to have you here. Ambassador Hogan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Max, and thank you for this opportunity to speak about literally the issue that certainly the European Affairs Bureau, but I would venture to say pretty much the entire U.S. government is focusing so much on, and that is to support Ukraine defend its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and democracy. This features prominently in the President's national security strategy because this is more than just Russia's brutal, unjustified war on Ukraine is more than just a land grab, although heinous as that is and has become. It's about a nuclear, saber-rattling, permanent member of the UN Security Council seeking to undermine the UN Charter principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and seeking to impose a new world order of might makes right. And when you combine that with the PRC Russia quote-unquote no-limit partnership and the PRC's own global ambitions to bend the world order to its will, the stakes in Ukraine couldn't be higher. And so that's why the President has made clear that the U.S. will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that, of course, involves providing Ukraine the security assistance necessary to defend its territory, more than $26 billion just on that front alone. That's why the United States has committed to providing strong economic and energy support to Ukraine. That's roughly $20 billion there to literally be able to keep the lights on in Ukraine and to be able to help Ukraine build back even better. And that's why we've provided humanitarian support on the order of $1.7 billion to be able to give the Ukrainians the resources necessary to provide for its citizens, the government, that is. And that's why this conversation is so important, is we're not in this alone. Right? I mean, allies and partners are standing up like never before. Their combined contributions have been on the order of $60 billion as well. So we are together working to help Ukraine preserve its sovereignty, its democracy, its way of life, and we're confident that we can pursue this effectively.
Maybe could ask you, you started in this role in September of 2021. Mm-hmm. Obviously, throughout the fall of 2021, there was a lot of focus on Russia potentially invading. When you sort of look back at the last year and a half and the efforts that your bureau has made, how have things changed from sort of before war to after war? Have you, I assume the pace has gotten much higher. Have you been running around Europe asking countries to do more? Is that kind of a major part of your job right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. Prior to the war, we only had a few months. Let's keep that in mind. I only had a few months. I arrived in the position in July, and we first got word of what Russia was up to October, early November timeframe. So we only had a few months of sort of the normal busyness of a bureau. But during that time, it's actually quite prescient, the work that we were doing. We were focused on revitalizing our alliances, right? This again features prominently in the President's national security strategy, that we are not going to be doing anything alone. And so it was just that focus on strengthening NATO, on strengthening the partnership between the U.S. and the EU, on the OSCE, making sure that the U.S. voice was heard there in the most effective way. All this was part of our work prior to the intel that we began to receive about Russia's plans for Ukraine. That allowed us to harness all that energy, all that goodwill that we were generating with our allies and partners in this most pressing task ahead of us.
When you look at the impact of U.S. assistance and the current role that it's playing in supporting Ukraine, and you look at it over the last year, what's your assessment? I mean, many folks have pointed to this as sort of a real example of U.S. aid playing a huge role. And I'm curious from a battlefield impact, how is the State Department right now assessing kind of the impact of its aid, and what role did it play over the course of the war?
Well, this has been a whole of government approach. So the assistance that we've been providing really has come from so many agencies, obviously State Department being a key one, but USAID, Treasury, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, and many others. This is something that the President has made clear that we will be standing with Ukraine in all the lines of effort necessary. And so I would say that the assistance has been quite effective. I mean, just to take one example, Russia began to weaponize winter, right, late last fall, and try to dismantle the energy grid in Ukraine. Our aid pivoted right away to providing Ukraine with the parts necessary to keep the grid working, to keep the grid alive. Auto transformers and gas turbine generators. I mean, these are things that I didn't know much about prior to this job. Have come to know quite a bit about these things, and literally going around the world, not just the State Department, USAID, DOE, Department of Energy. And also, of course, working with utilities here in the United States to see what we can do to give Ukraine the parts, the equipment, the know-how to be able to keep literally the lights on. And that is exactly what happened. And so they've gotten through this winter. Of course, the Ukrainians did a lot of important things, innovative things, such as reducing their consumption, and of course, just the grit of the Ukrainian people. They were prepared to go through some cold nights, some dark winters. And so all that together has allowed Ukraine to come out of this winter not just barely surviving, but now they're beginning to even sell electricity to neighbors through some incredible tools that the EU has provided them, for example, with NSOE, which is the swapping and buying and selling of electricity in the European market, connecting Ukraine as well as Moldova to that. And so they're able, because of the increase in wattage that the Ukrainians are now able to access, they can sell some of that electricity to, again, generate income.
One of the, there's been a lot of focus on military assistance, but the economic assistance part tends to sort of not make the same level of national headlines here in the United States. But as you know, on the energy side, it was incredibly important. How have you kind of worked with the Europeans when it comes to economic assistance, and how important is that, is maintaining economic aid right now for Ukraine?
It's extremely important, and our cooperation and collaboration with Europe, European Union, IMF, G7 couldn't be stronger. We have provided something on the order of $18 billion already in direct budget support, and over the next several months in this fiscal year, roughly $4.7 billion that we will still be providing to the Ukrainians. The Europeans just this year alone are going to be providing 18 billion euros there, and that, of course, when you combine that with the IMF program recently announced of 15.67 billion over a 4-year period, you can see this is beginning to add up and to be able to help cover the financial gaps. And so what we're beginning to do now, in fact, I think just yesterday we had this Ukraine partnership conference where we're taking our government focus, our government support, our government assistance, and trying to combine that with private sector, private partnership, public-private partnerships, and so that's what we held here. We had a lot of important guest speakers, participants from Europe participate in this. In fact, the Ukrainian Prime Minister is here as well. Because again, we're all about doing this together. London soon will be hosting a Ukraine recovery conference, and I was with the Secretary just in Brussels last week, and he was engaging his UK counterpart, James Cleverly, on this, and so we are gearing up for that as well, because we know that government support alone is not going to be sufficient. Private sector has to get involved, and they want to get involved. So we see this as very much complementary.
How satisfied are you with the current European contributions to Ukraine, at least maybe just in the economic space? Do you feel like they're doing enough?
Very much, yeah, very satisfied. Of course, we all have to keep upping our game because this war is not over yet, and so the needs will continue to grow. But the level of collaboration, the level of synchronization of our efforts, and for example, now we're thinking about, and with very much Ukrainian support on this, thinking about how we can attach conditionality to our assistance so that reforms continue to move at the pace that the Ukrainian government itself has set out. And so we're beginning to do that with our assistance. IMF, of course, is very much based on conditionality, and of course the EU is as well. So we're all moving in that direction together.
Maybe to turn it back to the military side. Now, there's been a lot of praise for the administration, especially from Europeans, about the level of assistance, but there's also been a fairly hefty critique that, what about aircraft? What about F-16s? Why has it been so slow on providing tanks? And shouldn't we be moving faster on a lot of the assistance? People pointed to long-range items, such as long-range fires, such as ATACMS. How do you think the administration could do more? Are you looking to do more? What do you think what do you think of that critique that says that, well, you've done a lot, but you really should be doing more?
I think this has been a dynamic endeavor every step of the way, meaning that we, the U.S. government, not just the U.S. government, there are something like 50 partners and allies together working to provide Ukraine with the security assistance tools that it needs to defend its territory. We are in constant conversations and coordination, planning discussions with the Ukrainian government, with the military leadership, and our military experts have assessed that the assistance that we are providing with Ukraine is appropriate for the moment that they are in the this phase of the war. We have been very clear in terms of what we are prepared to do to help the Ukrainians be able to defend its territory, and we've seen the success and the impact of that. So I would say that we are doing what we should be doing, but we're constantly evaluating. The Secretary of Defense, Austin, brings together, at least on a monthly basis, this Ukraine contact group, defense contact group, to be able to assess with our 50 partners and allies what it is. And this, of course, this is co-chaired by his Ukrainian counterpart, and they are discussing exactly what needs to be done. And so we've been very much supportive of that.
I asked you about your characterization of the European economic support, but I'm curious on the military side as well. The administration, I think, was clearly frustrated somewhat with Germany over the Leopard tanks. They eventually came good and committed to providing them. How would you kind of characterize the European response when it comes to providing military assistance, and are you sort of encouraging them to do more in certain areas?
I think it's a collective. We all need to do more in all the areas that our military command has determined with the Ukrainians that needs to be done. I mean, the Europeans alone have provided over $24 billion just in security assistance, and so that is quite a lot. And we've seen how rapid they are. How rapidly they are trying to meet the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces. For example, the European Union just adopted not too long ago a €2 billion program for munitions, 155 millimeter rounds, to be able to produce at least and donate at least 1 million rounds to Ukraine over a 12-month period. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. That's the sort of needs that the Ukrainians have identified, urgent. Of course, we've been doing the same thing, whipping up within our own stocks of the rounds and going to other countries, doing the same thing on air defense, doing the same thing on armor, doing the same thing on artillery. We call these the 4 A's, really, because these are the main focus points that we have been drilling down on.
And maybe just on the EU's response, because this is fairly unprecedented for the European Union. It has never, used its budget to buy weapons. Exactly. That there was a common view that it couldn't do that. Exactly. But the United States has long been sort of skeptical of the EU playing a defense role, and it seems to sort of have gone away. I mean, is the administration really supportive of the EU doing a lot more when it comes to defense support for Ukraine and playing a bigger defense role?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason why the Secretary was in Brussels last week was for the NATO Foreign Ministerial. And obviously a lot of discussion focused on Ukraine and our support for the Allies' support for Ukraine. But we had a session with the EU High Representative Borrell in attendance. And it was very clear the complementarity between NATO and the EU when it comes to ensuring transatlantic security, the NATO being the cornerstone of that, of course. But when it comes to Ukraine, the incredible support that the EU has provided. Again, I mean, we can't think about these as two distinct entities, right? 96% of the EU is made up of NATO countries. So there's incredible. And
now even more with
Finland.
More with
Finland.
Yeah.
Big win. And Sweden on the way, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But we are seeing that the EU not only can, but it is willing to meet the times. I mean, these are consequential times, and so we've been very satisfied with what the EU has been able to do, and will continue to do.
Maybe let me turn to sort of look toward the future a bit. There's been, there's concerns here in Washington, concerns in Europe about the ability of the United States to maintain its level of support. Congress obviously changed with the midterm elections. The Republicans are in control of the House. I assume the administration will have to go back to Congress relatively soon, perhaps in the summer, at least, or toward the end of the fiscal year. What do you think the prospects are for Congress to appropriate additional funding for Ukraine?
I think the level of bipartisan support for Ukraine has been remarkable, and I'm confident it will remain so because of what I'd said at the beginning. The stakes couldn't be higher. This is not just about Russia. This is about the Russia-PRC nexus, and this is about the PRC learning lessons, deriving lessons from how we handle the situation, this crisis in Europe. And so that is not lost on anyone, certainly not lost on Congress. And so I think because of this and many other reasons, the level of support will be there.
Is the U.S. government, are you all planning, are starting to think through contingencies that if the funding doesn't materialize, if there isn't a new appropriation, because that would have to be, passed by Congress, and it may be difficult in this current environment. Are you trying to figure out how you can continue supporting Ukraine even if that money does not come through?
I think one of the most I have to say, in my 26 years now in government, one of the most eye-opening experiences for me has been just the extent of our contingency planning. I mean, literally from the moment we heard, we read that Russia was looking to unleash havoc, not just on Europe, but not just on Ukraine, but on Europe and the world. Our contingency planning just went in full speed, and that has not stopped. So we're looking at all scenarios. But again, I think one of the fundamental aspects of our approach to Ukraine is that we are doing this together with our allies and partners, and not just in Europe. Right? I mean, this is something where we've seen, the allies and partners, and some want to be much more vocal about it, some less vocal about it, but we've seen this from Latin America to East Asia to Africa, and so we together, we believe, despite perhaps shifting winds, we think we can navigate this course, and so again, we plan. Of course, we plan, but we're still expecting the level of support necessary to get the job done.
One of the, I think, current think tank concerns that is often expressed is that, we've provided Ukraine equipment for hopefully this counteroffensive that's coming, but then what about 2024, 2025, 2026 when no matter what happens with the current conflict, Ukraine will have to rebuild its military. It will have to replace the tanks that we've currently given it, because those tanks will likely be damaged in the course of conflict. Yeah. How do you see the long-term sustainability here of really needing to recapitalize and rebuild a Ukrainian military for the long haul to deter Russia from invading 5 years from now or 10 years from now?
I think one of the lessons learned from us, from this whole tragic drama in which we're all living, is that we have to help Ukraine not just be able to defend its territory now, but provide it the resources as well as the anchoring necessary to prevent, or at least to deter, Russia from doing something like this in the future. So that's exactly why not only the United States, but allies are talking about long-term relationships with Ukraine, right? And when it comes to security, when it comes to economic, that's why we've been major champions of Ukraine's integration into the European Union. We were cheerleading this probably as much as the Ukrainians themselves when it comes to the EU providing candidate status for Ukraine as well as for Moldova, and so working very closely with Europe, with the EU, to help Ukraine meet the benchmarks necessary for hopefully by the end of the year, a positive assessment from the EU when it comes to being able to open up formal negotiations. And so I think we're in a good spot when it comes to the level of coordination with the EU and as well as with Ukraine. They're fighting a war, At the same time, they're making reforms. At the same time, they're trying to build back their economy. Extraordinarily difficult thing to do, but we've been doing it together.
Maybe I could ask a bit about EU membership for Ukraine, because I mean, it strikes me as critically important to the future of Ukraine. Economically, we've seen when Eastern European countries, for instance, became members, the kind of economic growth that came about and the kind of convergence with the EU and with Western Europe. Sometimes Europeans, when we push on EU enlargement, will say, "Butt out! This is none of your business. This is our union, not your union." But on the other hand, all that we're doing for Ukraine, what we've done in the Balkans in the past, and for others, what role do you see the United States playing in kind of encouraging this process or trying to advance Ukrainian membership?
I would say we are playing a very important role. First of all, we're invited, right? The EU very much sees us as its partner in helping Ukraine move down the path towards EU accession. And so, just one example that I think I mentioned earlier, that is linking our assistance, right, conditioning our assistance, which again Ukraine is very much supportive of, to reforms. Well, these reforms are in keeping with EU accession requirements, right? The EU put forward recommendations that the Ukrainians have to implement, and so we want to see those reforms just as much as the EU wants to see them implemented. And so I would say just that example alone demonstrates that we're moving in the same direction, supportive very much of that. But again, I mean, we're also looking to strengthen the U.S.-Ukraine economic partnership. I mean, this event that I mentioned yesterday, American companies there. American companies connect with us all the time in the State Department and other parts of the U.S. government to say, okay, what can we do? How can we support? Where are the investment opportunities? So we see this as obviously a Europe thing, but also very much transatlantic.
And what about NATO? I know there's been suggestions that Ukraine needs a security guarantee of NATO. Obviously, they're in a state of war right now with Russia, so it makes it sort of difficult. What do you say to Ukrainians when they say we would like to join NATO?
We say we hear you, and we very much maintain NATO's open door policy. But NATO itself is focused on practical support to Ukraine, because right now Ukraine is in a war. Not a war of choice for them. Certainly a war of choice for Ukraine. I'm sorry, for Russia. And so what we spent some time on last week in Brussels, and I'm sure what the Vilnius summit in July will spend some time on as well, is talking about how we can improve Ukraine's interoperability, its capacity building, and that's what NATO is really good at as well. And that will be complemented by U.S., other countries, other allies and partners, long-term support for Ukraine in the security sphere, in the economic sphere, et cetera. So we see a role for NATO, but more so in the capacity, in the institution building, setting standardizations. I mean, very important things that may not sound that wow, glitzy, but procurement standards, right? Command and control, digitalization. These are all very, very important concepts that Ukraine itself knows needs to do even more of, and so that's where NATO will be focusing.
Maybe I'll shift to a topic that is now dominating the headlines right now: the leaks of classified documents. You're obviously the kind of frontline diplomat that then now has to go and engage with many of our European partners. And the Ukrainians, and I guess, what are you saying to these partners, and do you think this has had any sort of battlefield impact potentially on Ukraine?
Well, because of the maturity of our relationships with Ukraine, but with other allies and partners, we've been very pleased so far with the level understanding that this was unauthorized. This was a criminal act, as Department of Defense made clear very much yesterday. And obviously this is very unfortunate, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all. That said, our confidence in Ukraine's ability to mount a successful, effective counteroffensive hasn't been shaken, isn't shaken, and we will continue to do what we can to make sure that they are able to achieve their goals on the battlefield.
So have you had to, the last few days, have to sort of clear your calendar and make lots of calls?
There have been lots of calls.
Lots of calls.
There have been lots of calls, but not just. But again, this is a whole of government approach here, because again, these are relationships we care about, and we want to make sure they understand what we're doing about it, what we're doing in terms of our investigation, what we're doing to isolate this, make sure this doesn't happen again.
I want to maybe turn to the Indo-Pacific. There was a lot of concern from the administration about China potentially providing arms to Russia. President Emmanuel Macron just went to China. His trip drew a lot of headlines, a lot of concern about his tone vis-a-vis China and especially Taiwan. Were there conversations with the French about Allied unity in the face of the Chinese potential threat to Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific?
We've had extensive conversations and consultations with our European allies and partners, and generally speaking, we very much remain in sync when it comes to the threats, the challenges posed by the PRC, and so the conversations are ongoing. I would note the European Commission President von der Leyen's very, very clear statements prior to her speech March 30th, but as well her statements in Beijing, very strong, very clear, as well as the German Foreign Minister Baerbock in Beijing as well. We see very much still a common assessment of the threat, and we've begun to work very closely on a common approach to dealing with those challenges.
And how is the relationship with France working on issues in the Indo-Pacific? I know there was a state visit of Emmanuel Macron, but the French are a Pacific power. Are relations positive when it comes to working with France when it comes to China and the Indo-Pacific, or was this?
Yeah, no, I mean, and again, we've come a long way since AUKUS, right? So that was one of the things that I had to work on right away when I started in this position nearly a couple of years ago. Come a long way to really dealing with this challenge in a coordinated way. The Madrid summit last year, where we had the Indo-Pacific partners there with us, talking, collaborating in terms of how we deal with this a threat. And that very much being the case in the summit in Vilnius as well. I will mention the ministers, the foreign ministers, just last week. We had our Indo-Pacific partners there as well. Again, and allies basically understand that it's not the alliance, NATO, United States looking for problems in the Indo-Pacific. The PRC has actually brought challenges to Europe, right, when it comes to the hybrid warfare, the cyber attacks, the surveillance, the intel, all of that, and the economic coercion, the fact that the EUs had to develop very, very strong anti-coercion tools to be able to resist and push back on the usage of its economic might to achieve political ends, Lithuania being a case in point on that. We very much see these challenges similarly, so we'll continue that coordination and collaboration.
Maybe if there's any questions from our studio audience, I'll be happy to take them in a moment. One of the concerns is that the administration's focus on China and the Indo-Pacific will, over time, begin to distract from from the focus on Ukraine and Europe, and that essentially it's a zero-sum game when it comes to resources in the administration, both in where our military forces go and also in terms of our assistance and our ability to provide military aid. Also, just the ability of the Secretary of State. Where do they travel, because they are one person and it's more limited. Do you think that's going to be a challenge to supporting Ukraine over the longer term, that we've kind of had a European moment or European year, but we're now really going back to kind of the pivot to Asia?
I think that the PRC's role in the Russia-Ukraine war makes it very clear that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Mm-hmm. That we have to be able to deal very much with the near and present danger that Russia is causing, and at the same time look square in the eyes of this PRC-Russia nexus. I mean, the fact that Russia is actively soliciting lethal support from the PRC. Our government, the U.S. government, has made that clear. Right? We've been very open about what we've been seeing Russia trying to do here. The fact that Xi Jinping has had countless engagements, visits back and forth with Moscow, with Putin, but has yet to engage Zelensky, mm-hmm. and at the same time claiming to be a responsible actor, even going so far as to say a mediator, has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with squarely, and so I say that over the long term, we need to continue to be able to deal with both the PRC and Russia, because they are dealing with each other. Mm-hmm. They are deepening this quote-unquote no limits partnership. And so we have to deal with that.
Great. We have a question from the audience. Karsten, if you would introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I'm a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. So Ambassador Hogan, thank you so much for taking your time this morning and sharing your thoughts and insights. It's really interesting to listen to. If I may, I would like to look a little bit into the future, let's say after the war ends, so to speak. There's a NATO summit coming up in the summer, and there was you already talked about a little bit about NATO membership, as the Ukrainian government really wants membership, but I guess we can all agree that's not going to happen tomorrow. But nonetheless, at least in my assessment, there will not be sustainable peace in Ukraine until there's a certain Western security guarantees. So could I challenge you perhaps to reflect a little bit on that? What kind of guarantees can we offer short of a membership, at least in the transitional period to an eventual membership can take place? What can we do to really secure a future stable Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you, and that's a question that we are very much grappling with right now. So I don't want to preview too much of what we have been thinking about. But I will say that we recognize that our commitment to Ukraine is a long-term commitment. Not only something we recognize, but we very much welcome and embrace because of the role that Ukraine will play in European security over the long term. Mm-hmm. Let's just think about this for a moment. I mean, Ukraine will have, probably outside of Turkey, the largest, most modernized, most advanced armed forces in Europe, right? And we want to ensure that the interoperability of Ukraine with allies and partners is strong. We want to make sure that we're all and will remain on the same page. So we have very much a vested interest in a long-term partnership with Ukraine. So I think we will be moving in that direction. But we've got to deal with first things first. First things first is helping Ukraine, first of all, achieve its goals in the upcoming counter-offensive. Then holding the territory that Ukraine will get, and then seeing where we are when it comes to Ukraine's ability to revive even more its economy. There's so many things that we need to be doing right now, and based on the conversations that I was part of in Brussels last week and continuing even this week, confident that we will be doing this together with this incredibly strong and cohesive alliance and coalition.
Great. Neil.
Hi, I'm Neil Nolden, the Director of International Security at RUSI. Thank you very much, Ambassador Hogan. Really appreciated your comments. I had two questions. The first one is just picking up actually from your comments just now about the long-term issues, and I was wondering about the relationship between EU membership and NATO membership. You spoke, I think, strongly about United States support for the EU membership prospect for Ukraine, but enlargement has tended to go sort of hand in hand with NATO membership, particularly to the east. So NATO membership has preceded EU membership because it's been fundamental to addressing the security issues. So is the situation now that NATO membership will need to precede EU membership in the Ukrainian case? But then I wonder a little bit, because you seem to be suggesting that NATO membership is not the priority for the organization at the moment. We're talking about capacity building and training. So what does that mean for sort of timelines that we're looking at here? And secondly, perhaps just following on from that, take the opportunity to ask you about the wider region, because rightly Ukraine is front and center of our attention, and the war is the priority. But the wider region is clearly in trouble. We see that Belarus has now largely been incorporated into Russia's security space, Moldova increasingly fragile, very negative political developments in Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia potentially on the cusp of another major military confrontation. And this is taking place at the time that we are struggling with these issues of security architecture, about the role of the EU, NATO, the OSCE in very poor shape. Does this suggest that the United States needs to look again at this region together with its allies? Do we need to take a sort of a forward-leaning approach to a region that is clearly struggling?
Thank you. Excellent questions, both of them. So on the first one, we see these processes, NATO membership, NATO's relationship with Ukraine, and EU's membership relationship with Ukraine as distinct processes. When it comes to the EU, there is candidate status already offered, already provided to Ukraine, and so clear recommendations needed to be able to open formal negotiations, and that process is moving forward. When it comes to NATO, the alliance remains focused on helping Ukraine with the interoperability, with the actual sort of the software part, if you will, of Ukraine's readiness, its institutional capacity. These are things that we are very much focusing on, and that Ukraine has been benefiting from. So we see these processes moving distinctly and in different paths. When it comes to your second question, the wider region, clearly challenges, as you've outlined, but we also see opportunities there. On the challenges side, I very much agree that the Lukashenko regime seems to be on a weekly basis conceding more and more of its sovereignty to Putin, and so our sanctions were strong prior to, but Belarus very much remains in the crosshairs when it comes to their aiding and abetting Putin's brutal and unjustified war in Ukraine. The other countries that you mentioned, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the opportunities there, yes, the challenges, but the opportunities there are actually pretty bright. I mean, Moldova is in a situation right now where you've got a government, you've got a parliament, you've got a presidency that are all focused on EU integration. They also were given candidate status, and they're working hard. They're working hard to actually meet those objectives just as fast and sort of keep pace with Ukraine. Had the privilege to go back to Moldova just a few weeks ago to lead the U.S.-Moldova strategic dialogue, and very satisfied with what Moldova is trying to do in the face of clear Russian destabilization efforts that we highlighted and spotlighted just a couple weeks prior to the strategic dialogue there, where Russian proxies are trying to foment unrest, even violent unrest, and because of our intelligence sharing, the Moldovans have been able to keep that at bay. So we see real opportunities there. Azerbaijan, Armenia, similarly, yes, the tensions flare. I used to work in Baku and just know how fragile the peace there is. But we're trying to go beyond that and actually work together with both sides on an enduring peace, and have made a lot of progress there. The Secretary himself has been very much invested in this. Has had the leaders meetings with them, has been regular dialogue with them on the phone. I just spoke with one of the ministers yesterday. We'll be speaking with another early next week. Again, we are fully invested in this because we see an opportunity. We see an opportunity to bring the sides together and forge a treaty, a peace agreement that 30 years ago, I mean, this has been going on for 30 years, and when I served there in Baku, one of the two places, didn't think this was even possible. So seeing opportunities.
Well, we're just about at time, or we're at time. There's lots of other questions that I have. Maybe just to close, though, with one last one. There's hope that Ukraine will go on a counteroffensive, that Western aid is flowing into Ukraine. Are you confident, maybe to close, about Ukraine's military prospects in the coming months, and how do you sort of see things playing out right now?
Very confident in Ukraine's prospects. Russia has been fighting, waging a war of attrition, just trying to wear out the Ukrainians. They've resisted that. Bakhmut is a case in point in that the number of times that the Russians, Wagner in particular, or Prigozhin, I should say, in particular, have said, Bakhmut has been conquered. And again, even if that were to happen one day, we, as we said publicly, we do not see that as a strategic move by the Russians. But even there, the extent to which the Ukrainians have been able to resist that has just been incredible. Whereas in the case of Ukraine, they've been fighting with our support, with the collective support of the U.S. and allies and partners, been fighting a war of innovation. And we've seen just how much Ukraine has been able to surprise, to dumbfound, even I would say, the Russians. So while in no way saying how it's going to go, because, can't read the future, but I can say that Ukraine has proven time and time again that they are up to the challenge of defending their own territory. When you think about it, they have everything to win as well as lose in this. And so we see that. We see the stakes, not just in Ukraine, but the global stakes involved. And so I think that's why we will stay with them for the long haul.
Well, Ambassador Hogan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your efforts inside the U.S. government in supporting Ukraine and supporting the transatlantic relationship. And I want to thank all of you who are watching at home. If you enjoy this content, I urge you to subscribe to the Eurofile podcast. We'll also take this conversation and post it there. You can get that wherever you get your podcasts. And also, we released a new report this morning looking at European error enablers, and that is something you can go and find on our CSIS website. I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you to our audience as well. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.